Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Great American Story. I'm Ron Hoon. John Noetzel, as always, joins us. John is really the creator. I like to say he's the creative genius behind the Great American Story.
Use that term very loosely, my friend. Use that term very loosely.
And we just have fun. If you guys
Yeah.
could realize how much fun we have behind the scenes just brainstorming with each other on these great topics from history. You know, the other day we were talking about Old Ironsides, a ship that really began what ultimately became the mighty United States Navy, with pirates. It goes all the way back to the 1700s.
Yes.
But we also have this great relationship. You'll see it in just a minute with our friends at Fox Movietone. With the way news is done now is a little bit different than it used to be handled a long time ago. But it would have been incredible to sit in a movie theater and get up to speed on what's going on in the world.
The newsreels from back then were amazing. The music and narration was just a lot different than it is today, for sure.
And so today's topic takes us right into closer to modern times. I mean, we're going to be talking about one of the most well-known speeches, literally 6 words that came out of a speech in the last about year and a half of Ronald Reagan's time in his presidency, talking about Mr. Gorbachev. Tear down this wall, the clip that you just heard to start today's show. But boy, there is so much that leads up to it, just in terms, John, of what was going on in the world that put us in this situation. I grew up as a kid in the 60s. That was really the only world I ever knew, and it was a long ways away, but you just sort of assumed that this division, this gray gash, as Ronald Reagan referred to it, the Berlin Wall, and what it represented in terms of keeping one set of the population behind the wall, and what could be done in terms of trying to bring freedom to those people and everyone who suffered under the dictatorship of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the show is the Great American Story, and you might think, well, it's weird you're going to Berlin and you're talking about a wall in Germany.
Right.
But this is as much a part of the American fabric when you really dive into it and realize what an impact Ronald Reagan had on bringing freedom to Germany and to Eastern Europe, and how he played a pivotal role. And really the Cold War affected Americans. I mean, we as a kid, I grew up in the 80s, we were terrified at times, nuclear war and the thought of mutually assured destruction and all this Cold War stuff. So this is part of the Great American Story. And
well, one of the things I was just thinking about, a little light bulb that went off in my head when you started talking about, it's thousands of miles away from us in the United States, in Berlin. But I'm also remembering long before Ronald Reagan was president, another American president who went there and gradually led the way. I mean, this was such a long process that took so many years when John F. Kennedy went there.
Yeah.
And so you have these two kind of the bookends of these two American presidents, JFK saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and the crowd went wild.
Right.
I think all along the way, it was important for them to know that America was there with the German people,
100%.
Those who lived in freedom and those who lived behind the wall.
Right, and just to set the stage a little bit, really the wall arose from post-World War II. Basically, Germany was divided into sections. The Berlin was divided as well. The Soviet Union built this wall that separated Berlin, which was in the middle of East Germany, which was separated from West Germany. You had a free part of Berlin, and you had East Berlin, which was under communist rule.
Yes.
So very strange dynamic, and very the stories that come out of there about people, who lived in West Berlin and had relatives in East Berlin, never saw them for years.
Yes, sure.
And people trying to escape. And it really, you bring up a good point. It was just this, it was like this scar on the in Germany. And, you know, it's just amazing when you look at some of the stories and you see some of the stories and the building of this wall and just how the stark contrast between freedom of the West and the communist East.
And as a
Amazing.
matter of fact, here's what it looked like for people, literally going back to those days when that wall was there and separated one half of the German population with the other, from Fox Movietone News.
A graphic indictment of the moral bankruptcy of communism. Hundreds of families forced to the streets when their homes are sealed because they border West Berlin. That winter nears and they may be shelterless doesn't bother directors of this new example of red infamy. Though they know it's a crime against humanity, for they flash lights into Movietone's camera lenses in an effort to stop the picturing of their iniquity. A remarkable record of communism's failure to win a people who have experienced its tyranny. Smoke bombs, too, are resorted to in the desperate effort to prevent the picturization. The Reds don't want the peoples of the world to get the wrong idea, to come to consider that in their workman's paradise, all decency goes up like this in smoke. Even that is not enough. Reinforcements in the form of hosing trucks are called out to fight the truth at the benighted barricades. However, anxious West Berliners see the breaks for freedom continue. Here an old man risks death to escape the communist shackles. A gallant bid that even stays the gun of a red border patrol. He broke his leg, but there's no doubt he's thankful. Watching for friends and relatives creates etchings in anguish. An aged woman is the next to brave the Kremlin's bestiality. Volunteers from both sides of the barricades try to help the old lady, and the drama becomes tense when an East German detective turns up to thwart the bid for freedom. But at last, one more small victory for liberty, one more human soul snatched from communist degradation. Illustrating the extent of communist desperation is this callous destruction of homes in the face of East Berlin's agonizing housing shortage. It's to create a 50-yard buffer zone between the enslaved and the free. But in spite of the heavily armed guards, it inspires a new wave of escapes, with the populace harassing and distracting guards that the more intrepid may dash to freedom. In the annals of history, there isn't anything quite comparable with this strange situation created by the hated East German communist regime. And to prove the communists can't even rely on their guards, we give you these pictures. A turning of backs tantamount to saying, "Go ahead, we won't shoot." The continuing indictment of communism carries on with another dash from the new red slave camp. Heroism at the barricades worthy of a place in history with other stands for freedom. As two girls prove red ideology, when you have to live under it, is bereft of values.
I mean, people were literally willing, John, to risk their lives to be able to get to freedom. A couple of interesting stats for you here. One was that I believe 50% of everyone who tried to escape from East Berlin into West Berlin, because it was so close. I mean, the wall only went so high. If you were in like a 6-story apartment building, you could see freedom right across the street.
Yeah.
But it was literally a no man's land. And even though the East German authorities said they had to build that wall to protect the ideas of capitalism and more from invading.
I think it was the other way around because people were leaving
Correct.
and destroying their economy.
All you had to look at was which way the guns were pointed,
That's
and
right.
they would shoot to kill if you as an East German tried to leave East Berlin and get to freedom in West Berlin.
You bring up that no man's land part.
Yes.
That's that strip in between the walls, and you're right. It was shoot to kill. I mean, it was serious business.
Yeah.
And just stark contrast between life on each side of that wall. And we should say it was built in 1961.
Yep.
And
which is kind of when those highlights were all from the 60s.
Yeah, all from the 60s. Yep. And it certainly, we saw a lot of tension there throughout the years. In fact, there was an event in 61, the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie, where actual Russian tanks and American tanks squared off with guns pointed at each other because of the way the East Germans, or the East Berlin, was treating American officials and other officials who were traveling into East Berlin for business, and they were cutting off access. We literally came this close to war.
Correct.
I mean, and this, we're not even talking about the Bay of Pigs. This is under Kennedy, right?
Yes.
And we came this close.
And if you really think about it, Stalin, right from the start, he was convinced at the end of World War II that we, the Americans, weren't really interested in sticking around. You know, I think his dream was that he would have full control over Berlin because it was right in the middle of East Germany. Right. And, the Americans, they'll take off pretty soon. Well, there was an American sector, a French sector, and a British sector that made up 3/4 of Berlin. But the United States basically created an airlift to try to get supplies in there, and that was the one way that we really continued to assist these poor folks in the middle, in this little island of freedom in West Berlin, surrounded by all the rest of East Germany. And just the stories of what, how it led up to ultimately the destruction of that wall.
Indeed.
Sometimes at the hand of some very happy East and West Berliners.
Yes.
And we've got the whole story coming up for you here on the Great American Story. But John, let's go to our poll question, or not to our poll question, but our in-depth trivia question.
Yeah, this is a pop culture trivia question. Which of these blockbuster 1980s films released during Reagan's presidency became a cultural phenomenon for its depiction of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry, culminating in a climactic showdown meant to symbolize the geopolitical struggle? I admittedly struggled with this for a minute, but then it came to me. It was pretty clear. So this is a good one. Good pop culture.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I kind of go back and forth between A, B, and C, but we'll have your answer coming up. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Great American Story. Today's Great American Story happens thousands of miles away from America, in Berlin, Germany. And really, there's a wider view here because the pressure that was brought to bear, not just by Ronald Reagan and his desire to end communism and just the way it held people down in the Eastern Bloc, but there was pressure from Poland. There was pressure from Hungary. There were all these other nations that were really kind of under the thumb of the Soviet authorities, who gradually were moving ahead at faster speeds than the East Germans.
Yes.
In terms of trying to basically throw off the yoke of the Soviet Union. And let's not undersell the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev, as the leader of the Soviet Union, he once told one of his aides that the quote was something along the lines of, they, meaning all these Soviet satellites, all these countries that they had to kind of also try to manage, they're sick of us, we're sick of them, let's try to live a different way.
Yeah.
So you needed to have a leader on that end of things who was somewhat approachable to what it was that Ronald Reagan wanted to accomplish.
And that's really where it started. I mean, if you read through the history of it, that seems to be one of the main things. I mean, obviously Ronald Reagan was the peace through strength guy, and he called out the Soviet Union for what he called it, the evil empire.
Sure.
Right? He called it for what it was.
He once gave an evil empire speech that was credited, I think, with some other leaders there in the Eastern Bloc behind the Iron Curtain,
right,
as the power of those words from Ronald Reagan, well before he gave the "please tear down this wall."
Right.
By the way, there was no please.
That's
it was
right.
just tear down this wall.
That's right.
But the power of Reagan's words, even going back to the Evil Empire speech.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, he made a clear distinction between freedom and communism. I mean,
Right.
And I think that's where he differed from his predecessors. Nixon, Carter.
Right.
It was détente, right? So it was a different approach to the Soviet Union, whereas Reagan was like, no, they are the evil empire, and this wall should come down. But I think you're right. You bring up a good point about Gorbachev, because I think that was the starting point, right? Because he brought in glasnost,
Yes.
perestroika,
Right.
which were the two policies of openness, right?
Yeah.
More freedom of the press,
Sure.
More less economic. Not sure really what the word is, but more economic freedom for the country, not so strict.
Yeah.
So, of course, the thought was, is he just saying these things? Does he mean them? And Reagan wanted to get to the bottom of that.
And he had various advisors, some of whom were a little more hawkish and some who were a little more peace-oriented.
That's right.
In terms of, say, Caspar Weinberger, who was defense secretary. He's like, I don't trust him. I'll never trust him.
Yeah.
And then you had, I believe it was George Schultz serving as the Secretary of State, who said, no, I actually, we have a relationship I've been working on building, and there's something here. It is interesting, though, that Ronald Reagan spent so much of his political career, his post-movie career, as almost being like a lone voice in the wilderness about the evils of the Soviet Empire.
Yeah.
And one of the great stories that is told, John, I actually remember when this happened, having been in the news business back in the early 1980s, but he did this weekly Saturday radio address. And one Saturday he was getting ready to do it because he and Nancy would always go out to the ranch in Santa Barbara, up in the hills above Santa Barbara. And he was such a jokester that he's doing a mic check. And he says into the microphone, by the way, this is like a joke for, I don't know, the half a dozen people that are around there or whatever. He was always looking for a laugh. And he said, I've just signed legislation that outlaws the Soviet Union forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
The Great Communicator.
It got some laughs, I'm sure. Right? But as somebody gradually realized that, that was a hot mic, Mr. President, even though it wasn't already going out. That wasn't part of the live broadcast.
It turned into an Orson Welles moment here.
It was a tempest in a teapot, even though it was obviously just a joke.
Hey, before we continue, we got to get back to our trivia question.
All right,
we
let's
never
do it.
answered it. Trivia question. What blockbuster 80s film became a cultural phenomenon for the depiction of this rivalry? Ron, what do you think?
I think that because the phrase cultural phenomenon is used, I'm going to go with Rocky. It's almost impossible to oversell how big those movies were and the impact of Rocky IV. Although Red Dawn, I could see that too. But I mean, if we're talking about culturally iconic movies, I'm going to go Rocky.
You are right, my friend.
Yes.
Rocky IV.
Okay.
So remember the Ivan Drago and Rocky Balboa. And there's actually a scene in that movie. It was actually on last night, crazy. But there's a scene in that movie where there is the leader, when they fight in Russia, the leader looks like Gorbachev. He's very resemblant of. They have the whole Politburo sitting up in the rafters watching the fight, and there's a leader there, and I'm sure that was by design, no doubt. But I think this brings up another good point about this time period and in America, the Cold War. Pop culture was so affected by this.
Sure.
I mean, we look at just these three movies that we're talking about, or there's other movies, War Games. There's you remember this, I'm sure, the movie The Day After.
Oh gosh, yeah.
That I was in high school, and that was a big deal. I mean,
Sure.
You already had scared teenagers. This was like sending us under our beds. I mean, this was a big deal. So pop culture was totally affected by this. So the American psyche. We can't underestimate what the Cold War and really the symbol of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, had on America. It really had a huge impact.
Everything from American blue jeans, Levi's jeans, to Beatles music, was gradually kind of making its way into this very controlled society, not just in East Germany, but all the way to the heart of Russia.
Yeah.
Really where the USSR had its power base. And all of those things combined to, I think, create a whole generation that was honestly just fed up with the whole system.
Yeah.
And so they needed a leader that was more oriented, toward, as you said, glasnost and perestroika.
Yeah.
But Mikhail Gorbachev, it's so interesting. Ronald Reagan eventually convinced him, I believe this was actually, it was after he gave the speech. By the way, this whole episode is a lead up to the famous speech that he gave, which we're going to have more of that for you in the next episode.
Yep.
But in the months following that, which I think it was the summer of 1987.
87.
And by December of that year, guess who came to the United States?
Mikhail Gorbachev.
Mikhail Gorbachev himself.
That's right.
Reagan actually, he had this great idea. He's like, if I could get Gorbachev to come to America and literally take him on a tour. Reagan loved America so much.
He did.
He wanted to take him all around the U.S., with a sense of pride, but also to show that part of the world, look at what we have. And then look at, for example, just the buildings that were falling down in East Berlin and in East Germany and throughout the Soviet Empire. It wasn't working. Do you know that if you lived in East Germany, the wait for a car, which they built their own, it was called a Trabant, which was a little, just almost like the size of a lawnmower engine that just puttered around. It was known as the worst car in the world. And you had to wait for a new Trabant that ran basically, I think it was between 12 and 17 years just to get one.
You look at how each side of Berlin recovered from the war, right?
Yeah,
you had
right.
the Marshall Plan that was being used to build up West Berlin and West Germany. And then you had communism.
Right.
And it's amazing when you look at those differences and how it all turned out.
How's this for a stat for you? Like the most basics of life. I mean, today we all have our smartphones all over the world. Just to get an old-fashioned phone, 99% of West Berliners had a phone, and yet in East Germany, the number was 16%.
Wow.
So, I mean, there was still kind of communication that would go back and forth between
But they were closed
both
off
sides.
a lot of that was closed off,
Yeah,
right?
But, people knew all you had to do was look over that wall. Look at those nice cars over there.
Yes.
Look at how common it is to have something as simple as a refrigerator.
A bustling city.
Yes.
Culture.
Right?
Art, yes.
A phone. 16%.
And I think that's an interesting point too, Ron, because that kind of leads into on the speech that we're going to talk about in the next episode.
Right.
That was actually broadcast in East Berlin, so the East Berliners heard that speech, which is really kind of cool. And that's a good story. That's going to be a good part two.
Well, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to the Valley, this is very rare for a former world leader to have come here. I just got wind of it.
Yeah.
And I actually called into the newsroom and I said, so that was going to be on a Saturday. He was going to give a speech.
Yep.
At that point, I believe he was about 90 years old. And his escort here across the valley for his time, he was only here for a couple of days, was none other than Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day OConnor.
How funny.
Yeah. And I understood that there was going to be a news conference at the Arizona Biltmore right before he was giving the speech. And the picture that you see here, it was so cool. I mean, he just walks into the room, and it was like I was the official greeter. I mean, there I am, shaking the hand with the man who had such a huge impact on world history.
He did.
And when we get into the next episode, John, I think we can talk just a little bit more about what was his reaction. Right? I mean, there are a lot of people in the ear of then President Ronald Reagan saying, oh, Mr. President, please don't use that line.
Right.
they were afraid it could just literally like blow up years worth of work
Yes.
to try to bring the two sides together. But he decided, I'm going to deliver that line, and I'm going to deliver it right to Mr. Gorbachev. And obviously, as we know, everything in the following couple of years
Everything
went
changed.
just the way he wanted it to go.
Yeah, it sure did. And Gorbachev, the difference was he didn't stand in the way of that wall coming down, as we'll see.
Right.
And unlike his predecessors, he kind of was hands off.
Right.
And it was East Germany can do what they want, and we're not gonna control them the way they have been controlled. All part of that perestroika, glasnost, that whole new kind of way of thinking.
And
still under a communist regime. We should mention he
Yes,
wasn't
right.
he wasn't
Sure.
a capitalist by any means.
Yeah. All right.
But anyway,
So part one of 2 parts. The next part tells the whole story, the very day, the very night the wall started to come down. Hope you can join us for the next Great American Story.